friends ever since.
I have been running this YouTube channel for quite a while, but I only really started taking it seriously over the past year or so, or at least I decided I wanted to start making videos more regularly. And of course, when you decide that you want to start making videos more regularly, then you need to figure out technically how you're actually going to do that. And in some ways, I thought I had a bit of a leg up because I used to be at least a semi-professional photographer, in the sense that I made my kind of main source of income through working at festivals, nightclubs, and weird, you know, kind of side jobs. But anyway, that's what I did for a long time. And what I've discovered actually is that unfortunately, even if you have lots of camera gear, taking stills doesn't necessarily translate into taking video, definitely not technically speaking. And part of this is because after I decided that I didn't want to do photography as like a job anymore, I sold a lot of my old professional level camera gear and I just bought things that I thought were interesting. So I've got a lot of weird kind of manual focus lenses, a lot of kind of film SLRs and film rangefinders and things like that. But my main camera is a Sony ZV-E10, which does have some video functionality in there. But I discovered that none of this was really kind of suitable for what I wanted to do. There was no flip out screen. I didn't have any way to connect a microphone up to it and all that kind of thing. So what I decided to do was get a camera that would allow me to kind of do things fairly easily with as, you know, minimal fuss as possible. And so I got the GoPro Hero 9, which is what you're viewing me on just now, and I got that for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's nice and small. Second of all, with the media mod, you can plug in a microphone to it, so I've got a wee tie clip thing here so that I can just speak and then the audio is on the video and I don't have to sync it up. It's also got a nice wee screen up here so I can see what I'm doing and I'll know if things stop recording or whatever. All things which the old Sony A7 didn't have. And this has been fine for, you know, what I've been doing, and it's good to kind of be able to pick it up and move it around and stuff. But as time has gone on, it's kind of become clear that this isn't really good enough for what I want to do. And that's partly because if I wanted to do any kind of close focusing things or kind of move around and show things and, you know, zoom into my Eurorack or whatever, then it just isn't quite good enough. Now, I had been thinking for a long time about getting an upgrade to my Sony A7, maybe a Sony A7S III or something like that. However, they cost a lot of money, and so I wasn't quite prepared to jump in to buy a new camera body just because I wanted to do some video or whatever. However, I decided that the time had probably come, and so I was looking around for different options for cameras that I could buy, and the one that I ended up getting was the Sony ZV-E10. If you're interested in a more detailed, in-depth review of the camera and all of its particular features, then I would recommend going to watch Mark Bennett's Camera Crisis on YouTube, because he's got a great channel where he talks about lots of specifics about the body, which I'm definitely not going to go into. And he's also actually quite funny, unlike many of the other dry, humourless bastards that you find on these kind of YouTube camera reviews. Now, I'm shooting this just now on the GoPro, and what I'm going to do is switch over to showing you this so that you can see what the difference in quality is like. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you what lens I'm shooting with at the moment, and this is a Samyang 12mm f2 autofocus lens, and I've actually been really impressed with this. Even though this body is APS-C, so it's got a crop sensor, it's not full frame like my Sony A7, that means that this is about 18mm equivalent on APS-C, and even though it's kind of one of these cheaper digital plastic bodied lenses, it does actually feel quite nice, and it seems like a lot of these companies now are taking their design inspiration from Zeiss or Leica or something like that, and the focus ring and everything is really smooth. And I have to say, I don't have a lot of bad things to say about this particular lens. Anyway, I'm going to switch over and you can see just how different the output of this to the GoPro actually is. Doesn't that look so much better? Now you can appreciate my beautiful face with all of the increased clarity that this lens has to offer, and also of course the much more atmospheric background with its vibrant colourful bokeh that you only would be able to get from a wide aperture lens. Now obviously the GoPro was never set up to compete in this kind of arena. It's much more at home barreling down the side of a mountain strapped to somebody's helmet or on a motorbike or something like that. Its purpose and its raison d'etre is really to try and make sure that as much as possible in a frame is in focus as is possible, whereas with these cameras obviously you can get much more of that kind of interesting visual aesthetic, especially by using your own different lenses, but it does give you an idea of the kind of quality difference when you shift from something like a GoPro to using a dedicated kind of purposeful filming device. Now the lens that I've got on there at the moment is the 12mm, which equates to about 18mm on APS-C, and I think this is a particularly good lens for doing video work, at least this kind of video work, because not only is it wide enough that you get all of this contextual information because, you know, it shows you what's going on in the scene, but also is at f2, which is actually quite a wide aperture for a lens like this, and it means that you get that kind of nice, you know, rendered out of focus areas. With that said, a 12mm lens alone did not build Rome, and so if you're going to be doing other stuff like making videos of synthesizers, for example, then you're going to need a bit more in the way of, you know, closer focal lengths. And so because of that, I decided to buy a few different lenses, so I had a variety of options. The first one that I got was this one, and this is a 16mm f1.4 lens from Sigma. As you can tell, it's quite a nice big beast, and it's got a kind of construction that I think is both metal and plastic, but it feels very nice and premium. This is also one that Mark recommended, so I'm going to blame him for all the money I've spent. The next lens that I got was this one, which is a 30mm f1.4, also a Sigma. Sigma get quite a good reputation for their lenses they're making nowadays, and as you can see, both of these are quite chunky. The 16mm in particular is quite substantial. This is a bit of an issue for me, or at least it's been a historical issue for me, because I don't really love shooting big lenses without having a body that allows you to balance them out. And in the past, what I've always done with my cameras is to get one of these things and stick it in, and this is a battery grip, and basically you just put a couple of batteries in there and slide this in, and this gives you more bulk on the camera itself so that you can balance things out and it doesn't feel kind of as lopsided. And I did think about getting one for this camera because that would make these bigger lenses feel much nicer. However, that would kind of destroy the point of it as kind of a wee portable thing, so you know, it's kind of a trade-off you have to make. The thing that's worth saying about these lenses though is that you're not going to get a wide-angle lens at something like 16mm at f1.4 without it being a chunkier bit of equipment. Like, there's just no way. When it comes to focal lengths or focal length equivalents, this one here, which is 16mm, works out at 24mm equivalent in APS-C land, and this one, which is 30mm, works out at about 45mm. So neither of them are particularly telephoto in the sense that they aren't too zoomed in, they're not too long focal lengths, and so I'm going to have to consider at some point getting perhaps something like a 75 or an 85mm perhaps, so that if I'm going to be focusing in on something like an OP1 screen, for example, which is quite small, then I'll have something that I can position quite high up, but also get all the details on the screen. But for now, I'm not going to do that. I do have a bunch of manual focus lenses that I can probably use if need be. Now, moving on from talking about the lenses to talking about the camera itself, this is a bit of a strange camera in the sense that it's marketed for, or primarily to, I guess, vloggers, and it even says so in the box, which I find very irritating. But when you look at what the vloggers on YouTube have been saying about it, it hasn't really received necessarily the warmest welcome that Sony maybe wanted or expected. Specifically, people are criticising the fact that it doesn't have any inbuilt stabilisation, or at least no in-body stabilisation, and for obvious reasons this is important to people who are vlogging, because you want to be able to have smooth footage without having all, you know, shaky, kind of juddery pictures on the screen. Now, if you watch any of the reviews of people who are talking about the lack of stabilisation in this camera and how that makes it inappropriate for vlogging, it's a bit questionable, because a lot of people, instead of doing what you're supposed supposed to do when you're shooting video, which is very conscientiously or very cautiously choose your kind of steps and make sure that you're moving in a smooth motion, then they're kind of haphazardly, you know, sticking the camera on a stick and talking to it and just moving about like with gay abandon. And this is, to me, doesn't make much sense, because even the best camera stabilisation in the world is going to struggle with kind of jerky movements like that if you're flinging it about like a drumstick. So I think that people maybe have unrealistic expectations, and you know, learning to get smooth footage even when you have very limited stabilisation is a skill that I think people should develop, and not just rely on their camera to smooth out everything, because that's not really going to give you the best possible footage. When I did my initial tests with it, especially with the 12mm lens, because obviously if you've got a shorter lens or a shorter focal length, then you're going to be able to have much smoother footage than you will if you use a telephoto lens. That's kind of a basic principle of photography that people should know. But when I tried it out with my 12mm lens, just kind of doing a pan on my dog as he walked up the stairs, then I get fairly respectable footage even from that without doing any kind of software stabilisation or any of that kind of thing. You should know that there is software from Sony called Catalyst, and basically you import your footage into that and it uses all of the gyroscopic data stuff that it collects when you're filming, and it gives you smooth footage out. And this isn't something that I particularly like, because I don't really like relying on specific software for fundamental features of devices, as you'll know if you watch my kind of synthesizer videos. But at least the option is there, and from all reports that I've seen, it's meant to actually be very good. Now, criticisms from YouTubers aside, there are many features about this camera that do appeal to people that are making vlogs or doing kind of video stuff, and many of them are the reason, or some of the reasons, that I decided to get the camera. For example, first of all, we have a nice flip out screen which comes out to the side. It's called a fully articulating screen. This means that you can actually see what you're doing and you can check that the scene is how you want it to be. And this might seem like a kind of trivial thing, but it is really important when you're on your own and you're having to set things up yourself to know what exactly is in the screen and where it is and all that kind of thing. The second thing about this camera that's really good for making videos is the fact that there's a very obvious red light on the front of the camera when you're recording, and also there's a very large kind of red border that gets put around the screen to make it clear that you are recording. And again, this is something that might seem stupid, but actually on previous cameras that I've used, it hasn't always been obvious if you're recording video, and so it's particularly nice to have that feature in there. Some other things that are particularly useful are the placement of the buttons on the camera. So for example, on the top of this camera, there are two dedicated buttons that are specifically related to shooting video. Rather than having a wee tiny wee red button on the side of the camera like on the Sony A7, on this one there is a very large red button on the top of the camera which you press to record your video, and it just gives you much greater access to that, which makes sense if it's been directed at vloggers. The other features about this which are particularly nice are that it has not just a microphone input slot, but it also has a headphone output jack, and that means that you can monitor what you're doing whilst you're recording it. And this is something that I think is really useful, particularly for people who are doing synthesizer demonstrations, for example, because then you can ostensibly hook up this camera to a mixer or just to a wee synthesizer like an OP1 or OPZ or something, and record straight in and have everything synced up, and you can hear it as you're going, which is really nice actually. Though with that said, there does seem to be a significant amount of compression on the audio in there, so I'll need to poke about and see exactly what it's doing. But the fact that those jacks are on there is great in itself, because not many cameras actually have that kind of level of input and output. Now, the final feature that is particularly useful if you're making videos is something called product showcase mode, and this is something that I showed off earlier, perhaps without you realizing it, and that is where you show things to the camera and it very quickly snaps focus to whatever is closest. And this means that if you want to show off a lens, for example, then you can hold it up and the camera will lock onto that, immediately focus, and then when you put it down, focus back on your face. And this means you get far less of the kind of
focus hunting thing that you often see when you see people going, is this in focus? Is it almost focused yet? So now we come on to some of the things that I personally don't love about this camera, because there are a few of them. First of all is actually related to product showcase mode, and that is because there is no easy way to turn product showcase mode off. If you want to turn off product showcase mode, you have to stop filming and then you have to go into the menu and turn it off, or maybe use a hotkey or whatever. But I don't really understand why there's no way you can't just turn it off whilst you're filming. Maybe there is on the iPhone app or Android app or whatever, but I haven't been able to find it. So if somebody knows, please tell me. The reason that this is particularly important is because if you have product showcase mode on, that means that if you start, moving your hands about, then the focus can very quickly and easily get distracted. And one of the things that really annoyed me today was that I already recorded this entire fucking video, and I realised that every time my hand came up, the focus was just getting completely thrown out of whack because I had product showcase mode on. And so that is not ideal. If there was a way to quickly turn it off, perhaps by touching the screen, then it would be so much more useful. This leads me on to my next big complaint, and that is that the screen, whilst it is a touch screen so you can select focus on it, you can't do anything in the menus on the screen. And at first I didn't think this was that big a deal, right? Because who cares? Like, I don't need a touch screen menu. However, when you realise that a lot of the time when you're using a vlogging camera, you're going to be here in front of the camera, you're not going to have access to the menu buttons at the back of the screen or the back of the camera. That presents a challenge, because if you want to change certain functions whilst you're recording, which isn't all that unusual, then you can't actually do it without having to feel around in the back of the camera. And of course you don't know where the buttons are, so then you have to go around the back of the camera, and then you're presented with the next problem, which is when you click on the buttons on the back of the camera at the back, the screen is facing forward, so you need to flip the screen round in order to see what's going on, and then flip it back once you've made your settings changes, and all this time you've fucked up your camera position, and it's very annoying. It could all have been avoided if they just made the screen touch sensitive for the menus. And I mean, it's 2021, so that really isn't all that much to ask, really. The other thing that I don't love about this camera is also related to this screen. Now, in previous incarnations of this camera, the screen flipped out up the way on top of the camera, and that got a lot of criticism because obviously if you have something in your hot shoe, for example, like a microphone or a wee light to light up your scene, then that obstructed the screen and there's nowhere else for it to go, so you couldn't actually see the screen, so it was completely pointless. So on this particular camera, what they've done to address that is made it a fully articulating screen, which means it comes out to the side, and that is much better. You don't get the kind of obstruction from the hot shoe mounted devices or accessories that you've got on there. But this presents its own problems because the microphone input jack and the headphone output jack are both in front of the screen, and this means that when you stick in your headphones, it obstructs the view of the screen. And I really don't understand why they would make a design choice like that. I don't get it at all. Speaking of weird design choices, there are a few other things about this that just don't really make much sense at all from a practical standpoint. For example, the batteries on this are the same as the older Sony A7 batteries that they've used forever, and they're not the best. They run out very quickly and they could easily have used a different kind of battery. But that isn't a huge deal to me because I've got a Sony A7 and I'm quite happy keeping all the batteries that I've already got. What I'm annoyed about is that the SD card is actually inserted right next to the hinge of the battery compartment, and this means that when you're trying to get it in or out, it is incredibly fiddly, and it honestly does my nut in every single time I have to use this. Continuing on this vein, which has now become some bashing of Sony's design choices, on the front of the camera there is a wee dial thing which lets you zoom in or out if you have a lens which can do that. However, if you don't have a lens which is zoom capable, obviously it does nothing, but it doesn't do nothing because what it does if you press that or knock it in any way, which actually happens quite a lot, is that it displays an error message on the screen saying you cannot use this with this lens because it's not a zoom lens, and you have to dismiss it manually, and there is no way to turn off this warning, which becomes very irritating because it's right at the place that your hand rests all the time. One of the most galling things about having this kind of useless button here which you can't reassign is that a general criticism of the camera is that there aren't as many buttons on there as you might like, especially for a camera that's trying to be two things or be lots of things to two main groups of people, photographers and videographers. And by that I'm talking about the fact that because a lot of the buttons have kind of been given over to video functions, there's a lack of accessibility to common functions that you would expect to have in a photography based camera, and this means that all of the kind of real estate is quite precious, and so to have a non-assignable dial on the front is just kind of bonkers, frankly. Overall, I actually really like the camera, and I know that all of those bits and pieces that I've just been outlining sounded like a big rant, but honestly, aside from those kind of minor design choices that are really quite strange, there is a whole lot to like about this camera. It is walking a fine line between trying to be too many things to too many people, but actually the Frankenstein hybrid kind of thing works for me because that's kind of where I am at. I kind of want a really capable video camera, but which also takes interchangeable lenses and which has a really good high ISO performance and all those kinds of things, because it means that I can really just take this wee camera out and about and be able to shoot videos, be able to take quite nice, technically good pictures, and not have to carry about some $4 camera that honestly I don't really want to spend the money on anyway. I am particularly impressed, I have to say, with not only the autofocus on this, but also the high ISO performance, because as someone who's shot lots of digital cameras for decades, the technology in here is really, really impressive in the sense that there is such a low amount of noise, even on the highest ISO, which is something like 56,000, which, considering I come from the world of film primarily and also digital cameras, that you are lucky to get kind of ISO 3200 without it being completely blown out. So I mean, I'm really impressed that on this wee tiny camera you're getting performance at that level. It really is pretty good. On that point in particular, I think that one of the big things I was concerned about with this camera initially before I bought it, or at least one of the things I was most reticent about, was going to APS-C from full frame, and that's because I have shot with full frame cameras for about as long as I can remember, and I was always kind of wary of going to APS-C, partly because I wanted to use lots of wide angle lenses, but also because the sensor quality and the high ISO performance was never as good on APS-C. But actually, seeing just how good the pictures and stuff come out from this and the video footage, I really don't have any other criticisms of APS-C at this point, particularly because there are now so many APS-C dedicated really wide lenses for really quite affordable prices. So if you're concerned about the shift from full frame to APS-C, then I genuinely wouldn't be, because I am a full frame fanboy and this has had no problems for me whatsoever so far. Anyway, that's my kind of take on the camera. That's the reason I decided to upgrade from my GoPro and why I chose this particular model of camera. I know it's not a particularly detailed, in-depth review. It really wasn't intended to be. If you want that, then you can go watch Mark's channel, because he's got loads of really informative, very detailed videos that are actually also pretty funny, as I mentioned. But for me, I think that I was looking for something that gave me the balance between being, you know, capable with video production and with all the kind of modern niceties of face tracking and all that stuff, but also which had the ability to use interchangeable lenses to be my kind of main travel camera if it needed to be. And even though this is a bit of a Frankenstein thing, then I think there are people out there like myself who are like that and who this camera would be perfect for. So if you're in that category, then I would definitely consider this, because I have not had any regrets about buying this so far. It's really kind of surpassed my expectations at this point. The one thing I guess there is to say about this is that even though the camera body itself is pretty good, it's fairly affordable, about £700, so relatively affordable in the kind of grand scheme of cameras. If you are not particularly focused, for want of a better term, on getting different lenses or using different lenses, then the ZV-1 might be a better option because it has a fixed lens on there, and then you don't have all the added cost of having to buy various lenses. Anyway, now that you've seen that I've upgraded my camera gear, you can expect lots of sweeping, fluid, smooth cinematic B-roll. You can expect nice close focus of me playing terrible chords on my synthesizers, and obviously the production value of this channel is going to rapidly increase, and so I would encourage you to tell all of your friends not only to subscribe but also to join my Patreon so that I can afford to pay off this crippling debt that I have now incurred thanks to this camera and all of those lenses. Either way, thank you for watching, and namaste.